Hello, this video is an introduction to Java EE. It's going to be a brief introduction to building a web application, a very simple web application in JSF using JSF, CDI, and JPA technologies. I am going to go through things rather quickly, but the text that you see in front of you in this browser, the code that I'm copying and pasting will be made available along with the final source code, so you can go through it at your own pace. There'll be a little extra detail in the text. So with that said, we'll get into it. So first of all, JSF, or Java Server Faces, is going to be a component-based web UI development framework that we're going to use, which is going to allow us to build the view. CDI, or Context Dependency Injection, is a dependency injection framework that adds in scoping and lifecycle management, which is going to be significant when we're building web applications, as you'll see a little later in the tutorial. And JPA, which is Java Persistence API, which is going to provide our object relational mapping and persistence. The skeleton project is going to be a Maven project. I won't get too deep into that. Assume Maven is given that you have that knowledge. So I want to just highlight, though, a few of the files that are going to be in the Maven project. You will see that I'm using IntelliJ. I've spent most of my career using Eclipse and love it, but recently started using IntelliJ, and I think I may love it more, but this is not an IntelliJ plug, I promise. It's just what I'm using. So the files I want to point out are beans.xml. Beans.xml is a configuration file for CDI that, when detected in a archive, be it a jar or a war, indicates that that archive is a beans archive, and that the container will scan it for CDI beans automatically. It's typically empty, but you can put other things in there like interceptor configurations and alternatives and things like that. CDI favors annotations over XML. XML is usually just used for configuration type items, so you rarely will see much in there. But the presence of the file is what's going to trigger the CDI scanning, so it's worth pointing out. The persistence.xml is a similar sort of thing, but for JPA. When the container sees it, it's going to enable the persistence layer, and this is going to be the configuration file for this archive. And the faces config.xml is an optional file. Right now there's not going to be much in it, but later in the demo you'll see that it's a good place to add your navigation rules for JSF. And then of course web.xml, which is your standard deployment descriptor, which in Servlet 3.0 is not required technically, but you'll often find you need to put some things in there. And in this case, I want to go ahead and associate index.xhtml as a valid welcome file. So on that note, let's get into that index.xhtml. So like any web application, we're going to start with some kind of HTML, or in our case XHTML. And this is a vanilla XHTML file. You can see there's nothing special going on here, and we're going to go ahead and run it inside IntelliJ, which is going to fire up our JBoss instance. I have that pre-configured, and so it's going to go ahead and deploy the exploded example.war, and then IntelliJ will go ahead and launch the web page for it. You'll see a couple errors fly by. We haven't gotten into it yet, but I have some sample data that's trying to import, but since we haven't really created our JPA objects yet, there's nothing to import it into, so don't worry about that. It was planned. So there's our hello world page. Nothing exciting. You can see the standard index.html was served up without any manipulation, and that's it. So let's go ahead and talk about the index.xhtml. So again, why XHTML? W3C Schools and a couple other sites have a lot of good information on why and why they're moving towards that. But in short, it's turning HTML into XML so that it's well formed. We can fix some of those errors that are out there and lingering around on the internet. But also enables some things, makes it extensible, makes the coding more precise and more maintainable, and enables tooling to do different things. In particular, one of those things will be namespaces. So XML can have namespaces, and in the case of JSF and and specifically facelets, which is a view technology that's used with JSF. Those namespaces are used to identify the tag libraries that you want to use on your page. So you can think of those as sort of imports for your XHTML page. When you're coding, you're basically declaring, hey, I need to use this tag library on this page, and that allows the tooling to do things like autocomplete and things like that. So let's go ahead and add these namespaces to our document. And when we do that, we can now make use of the H namespace, which is the HTML. So basically I've associated the alias H with the JSF HTML tag library. And you can see that it's now making available all those components that are in that library. The tooling sees that and so forth. So what you may be wondering is, well, why do I want to use the H to render the header and the body? Well, the reason we want to use JSF to render the header and the body is because once JSF's rendering it, any JSF components that are needed by the application, the resources that are required for those components can be automatically included in the header. So I'm going to go ahead and hot deploy that, and we will go ahead and reload the page. And you can see the page looks the same as it did before. But now if we view the source, you'll see there's a little more going on inside this header right now. Not a ton more, but basically the PrimeFaces JavaScript and the PrimeFaces theme are automatically being included. And that's because a dependency to this project right now are the PrimeFaces components, and we'll get into those later, but in my POM I've declared PrimeFaces as a dependency. And so because those JSF tag libraries are available, they are automatically registering that they need certain resources automatically loaded. So, but you can see the rest of the page has not been modified. So that is why we would use the JSF HTML components to render the header and the body, is to allow for that. So moving on, let's get into the JPA objects. So most of the time when I'm developing an application, I'm either starting with an existing database or I want to start with the data model. So we're going to do something similar. We're going to go ahead and create our first JPA object. And in this example application, we're going to be managing a list of employees. So let's go ahead and create a new employee JPA object. So we'll call this employee. And we'll go back to our documentation here, and we'll say make life easier on ourselves, and we'll just kind of copy and paste all this, save ourselves a little typing. And don't worry, I'll walk through it briefly. So this is a JPA entity object. What makes it an entity object is the @entity annotation. The other thing that you need to do when you add an entity object is we need to go to our persistence XML, and we need to go ahead and reference it in the persistence.xml. Now, technically this is not strictly required. You could set this flag right here, exclude unlisted classes, to false, and what will happen is the presence of a persistence.xml will cause the container to go ahead and scan the entire archive for @entity objects, and that's sort of a lazy way, if you will, to go ahead and just have everything sort of auto-register. The downside of doing that is you may, as you build larger web apps, you may have a lot of dependencies, and you may want to pull in a jar that has a persistence.xml, but maybe you don't really want the persistence unit that's defined in it, you just want the mapping, so you want to include that class explicitly yourself. That's one reason. But another would be that you may have a lot of classes in your deployment, and you don't want the container every time you deploy your application to scan through all those classes for entities. So it's just a way to sort of clean that process up. I'm sure there are other benefits that I'm unaware of, but those are the benefits that I'm aware of. So going back to the entity object, the minimal number of annotations you really need for an entity object are really just the @entity and the @ID. Entity objects must have some sort of primary key, and that's what the @ID instructs JPA, is that this is the primary key field. From there you can go and add other things. In this case I've added column mappings because I want to say, hey, you know, if you don't put a column mapping and you don't specify a name, it's just going to use the actual field name camel cased and all in the case of case sensitive databases like MySQL on Linux. So we may have to map those names. We may want to specify things like the maximum field length so that it doesn't pick the default, which is, I believe, it depends on the dialect, but it's typically 250 or something along those lines. So there's other information we convey with the annotations. It's always a good idea to make your JPA objects serializable, and while I didn't do it here, it's a good idea to implement the hash code equals and toString methods. So that would be our JPA object. So earlier I mentioned these errors you saw because it was, you can kind of see if you're paying attention that it's trying to insert into different tables, employee in this case, for example. Well, that table doesn't exist, so it couldn't do that. But now that we've created our JPA object and we added it to the persistence, we can go ahead and republish the application. And what we should see is that those errors have gone away. And you can see that they did, and now everything's deployed. So our database now has that information. And so what that is just for the curious, and I'll go quickly here, is in persistence.xml you can define some implementation specific properties if you like. And since we know JBoss is running Hibernate, we can tell it to create drop. What that means for Hibernate is when the application is deployed, it's going to create the tables based on the JPA objects, and when the application is done and it's undeployed, it's going to drop those tables. It's a useful feature for development, and when it does that, it'll also look for the presence of an import.sql file, and if it finds it, it will run it. So it's a great way to set it up so that when you're developing locally, like I am here, that the JPA entities, you can manipulate them, do all the things you want, redeploy, and you've got your new schema with some sample data populated into the schema every time. And it shortens that sort of round trip that you need in order to get the feedback that you need when you're making changes to your JPA objects, to be able to see it sort of immediately and continue to develop at a more rapid pace. So that's what that's all about. So what we want to do now is we're going to add a controller, because after all, we want to be able to query for these employees we just created and present them to the user, and we need some sort of controller bean to go ahead and handle retrieving that data so that the view layer can present it. So let's go ahead and add a controller, and maybe we'll put this in a UI package. We'll call it employee controller because this controller is for a particular UI, and we'll go to the cheat sheet here. Okay, so quickly going over this. So this controller is now a CDI bean. This @request scoped. Really, any Java class can be a CDI bean. You could even have no annotations on it. If you attempt to inject that class, it will still create an instance of it and inject it. That's a default scope that we call @dependent scope that won't really be demonstrated here, but just wanted to mention that really any Java class can be a CDI bean. But specifically with respect to the web applications that we're developing, more often than not we're going to scope some of these beans. And in this case we're going to request scope it, which means that this bean, CDI will create a new instance of it when it needs to per request, and when the request is over, it'll destroy that instance. So that's what the @request scope is. The @named means that this bean will be made available to the EL expressions inside JSF, basically to the view layer as a named bean. And the naming will be this, but with a lowercase on the front. Basically, it uses sort of the Java beans naming convention for properties and things like that. So it will be called employee controller, and you can override those names through the annotation attributes. The @persistence context tells the container that we need the entity manager within the scope or the context of this request, this transaction, and it will provide the correct entity manager or persistence context. And that also takes some attributes where you can specify which unit and things like that. And for that reason, the fact that you may have multiple persistence units, there are other ways to do this that I won't get into here, but for this demo, we're going to use the persistence context. And then we're going to add a method here that's going to go ahead and execute a typed query, meaning a query that we know is going to return a particular entity type, in this case an employee. And this is the JPA-QL query here that will select from employee, basically with no where clause. So we're just going to grab all the employees and then return that list. So that is what our controller is going to do. So we're going to now work on the view to go ahead and present this. So let's pop over to our cheat sheet and let's grab our code for displaying the employees. So you'll see what was added here was a new namespace called UI that's associated with facelets. The facelets tag library typically provides things for iterating over things, including other pages, inserting pages, templating, that kind of stuff. So where we're going to use that is we're going to say that we want a list, and then we're going to repeat over our collection of employees, and for each one we're going to assign it to a variable called EMP, and then we're going to go ahead and render whatever's inside this UI repeat. In this case it's going to be the list items, and we're going to make that list item the employee number, the first name, and the last name. So these pound curly brackets that you're seeing here are EL expressions, or expression language, Java expression language, and they're used heavily in JSF to bind things to the back end, to basically reference those CDI beans, those named CDI beans, so that you can actually get at your data and create your bindings. So that's what that's all about. So we'll go ahead and republish that, and we'll go back to our page, and we're going to refresh it. And there's our list of employees. So now, you know, I think it would look better if those were in a table of some kind, so let's go ahead and do that. So let's go back into our cheat sheet again. Oh yeah, another concept I want to talk about. So back here on the employee controller, or back here on the page, you can see that I referenced the controller dot employees. Which you can also notice that it uses a standard, bean properties naming convention. So get employees is presented as employees through the EL expressions. But if I didn't want to have to do that, I could actually, if I didn't really want to have to reference the controller directly for that, and I wanted to make it more globally available, I could actually name this method and put a produces on it. And by doing that, I can actually reference the employees this way. And you can see that works just the same. So you can create methods using @produces that actually produce things. Think of them as like factory methods and things like that. This may be too generic of a thing to produce that way, but maybe not. It all depends on your application. So as I said, let's go ahead and render this in an HTML table instead. So we'll pop over to the cheat sheet. We're going to grab this bit of code here. Oops. My bit of code is not the whole page, so I got to make sure I place the correct part. So what you see is I've replaced the UI repeat with an HData table. So we're using a component now out of the HTML, the JSF HTML tag library called a data table. It's very similar to the UI repeat in that it iterates over some set of data, and it even uses the value attribute to bind that. So we're going to bind it to the same list of employees, and it has the same structure. We use a var to assign it to a variable local to that iteration, and so we're calling it EMP, and you can see that what it then expects inside are some age columns. So column, which is out of the same tag library, to describe the columns that need to be rendered in that HTML table. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. Voila. So now we have an HTML table, and we'll look at the source. You can see it's some vanilla HTML, no extra bulk, no extra fat. These HTML components that are shipped with JSF do just that. They give you basically the skinny HTML. So going back to our page, these date formats, they're not my favorite. So let's see if we can't change the format of those dates. So again, back to the cheat sheet. And the point of this is just to demonstrate something here. We're going to add a namespace. This is going to be the JSF core. Contained in here are a lot of functions and things that are sort of independent of what we call the render kit, what's responsible for rendering the HTML, so that they're not tied to how you might render HTML. They sort of enhance the components that are around them. Those types of things are to be found inside the core. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to format these dates. So we have two dates. We have the hire date and the date of birth. So we're going to go ahead and do this. That could have been a little slicker than what I just did there, but So what's happening here is you notice I switched from an EL expression to H output text. We use H output text because we want it to be a component within which we can nest one of these convert date functions from the core. So the thing that's worth pointing out here is that the view tree that's built in order to render this view, it is just that, it's a view tree. So some of these components, or all these components, many of them can have children, and the child components can further enhance the parent component. So like the H column told the data table, these are my columns. This convert date time is telling the output text, this is how I want you to convert the date value that is in this employee to a string. Here's the pattern I want you to use. And so that's kind of an important thing, an important concept, because we'll use it quite a bit with JSF. So let's go ahead and see how this looks. Boom. We can see that those have been converted now. So in a similar way, we can add what we call facets to components. So facets are a name section, as it says up here, on a containing component that's registered with a component. The advantage is that these facets, or facets in general, are used to sort of enhance the containing component. It's sort of an optional thing. The component doesn't necessarily have to do anything with it, but you probably wouldn't be putting it in there if it didn't do anything at all. So anyhow, in this case, we're using the facet to describe the headers for each of the columns. And you'll see when we get to the PrimeFaces, there are some that do it as an attribute, so they'll say header text. The advantage of using a facet is that the facet is a container itself, if you will. So if I wanted to do something more elaborate, like display some components in the header, like maybe another input box for some inline filtering or something like that, the facet enables me to do that. So let's go ahead and republish. And let's refresh. So now we have our headers. Okay, so let's go ahead and style this up a little bit. I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little here. So again, this here is really just to demonstrate. Like, these are HTML pages. There's nothing magical happening here outside of of view technology. So application.css. Go ahead and create that, and we'll add some styling to it. And because we gave those a selector, we want to go ahead and specify that selector on our data table. So style as an attribute is used to, just as it is in regular HTML. Style class is used for the class, and I believe that was because there was some conflict with just class. I really don't know the history, but I know that that's the case. So there, that looks better. All right, so let's do some more interesting things. Let's put a form on here that the user can use to, let's say they're going to search for people hired after a given date. So we're going to go ahead and add a form to this. And the form basically going to take as some input a hired date or hired after date, and it's going to have a submit button, and because that submit button is just an H submit button, it's going to be like a regular submit button on any kind of HTML page. The whole page is going to refresh, and we're going to get refreshed data. But of course we have to implement that. So you can see what I've done here is I've added an output label for, you can see I've added an ID to this component. So this guy references this ID, so we know that this label is for this input text. Input text is just like the HTML input text. The H message is something that's going to dump out any kind of validation errors or messages for this particular field. It's going to dump it out in that location, and then there's our command button. You'll notice all of this is inside a panel grid. A panel grid is a component that will render basically a table, an HTML table, but for the purposes of laying it out as an input form, so for form inputs. In its simplest mode, you can specify the number of columns that you want on that table, and it will automatically just say 1, 2, 3, then next row. So the command button will end up on a row following that. You can see here I customized the converter message. If you don't, you'll get just this standard stock message, but I want something a little more user-friendly. So I'm going to go ahead and customize the message if the conversion fails. And what that means is that when we render these forms and when the data is submitted, it's always a string. It has to be a string. When it comes back into the Java world and we want to convert that into a date, there's some conversion attempt that's going to take place, and that's why we're telling it how. We're giving it the converter, and we're telling it what pattern we accept. And if that conversion fails, then this is the message I want displayed if that conversion fails. And all of this is inside an H form, which is the same as your HTML forms, but H forms in JSF are really important. Forms are used for all kinds of things, especially when we get into Ajax and other things. Values have to be submitted. Everything's about form submission, and that's how the data values are exchanged. So you'll see, really, you'll be using forms a lot to pull things together, and that's okay. So we have that, but you can see that we're binding to the hired after. We're basically telling that input to go ahead and stuff its value into the employee controller into a property called hired after. But we don't have that property yet. So let's go ahead and add that to controller. So we'll copy this, and we'll head over to Mr. Controller, and we'll replace everything in here. And let's fix up some imports. Okay, so what's happening here is we have our getter and setter for the hired after, because again, that's how the EL expressions work. They're looking for those bean properties. And we have the get employees method that I've modified now. You can see that the JPA QL query has a where clause and a parameterized query. It's looking for the hired after date, and we bind that to the value we have here, and we return the result. So let's go ahead and publish this. And let's go ahead and grab our browser, and let's refresh. So it's empty. That's because initially that hired after is null. So let's say 1980. And now we can see all the employees hired after 1980. Switch to 90. We can see there was only one person hired after 1990. And so that's how that works. So I guess if we wanted to discuss this interaction all the way through, this form is being submitted with this value. This controller bean, employee controller bean, because it's request scoped, is being stood up. The value is being set on the hired after date. Then what's happening is, since that's the end of the submission, there's no validation failures, no errors, there's no We're not really telling the submit button or the command button in this case to do anything. You'll see later that we'll assign actions to these, that we can actually have methods invoked to perform business logic, but we're not doing that here. So there's nothing else for it to do except come back and now render the page, or render the same view. Since we're staying on the same page, it's going to re-render that view. Now we're still in the scope of that request and that response. So this bean hasn't gone away yet. So now what's happening is when the page goes to render, this whole document's trying to render. When it gets to this data table and says, where are the employees? It's able to get that from this get employees method. The query runs and now has the correct hired after date, and we get the result set that we're looking for. So that's, and then the bean, then this request scope bean is destroyed. And so that is what is happening in that whole interaction. So let's, to kind of demonstrate the request scope bean, and also because we're going to want to make this more interesting, let's go ahead and add page navigation. So back to my cheat sheet. We'll head down here to navigation. So we have some results. Maybe we want to edit an employee. So we're going to put a link in to a new page. So back in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, instead of just rendering the employee number all by itself, we're going to make the employee number an actual link. So hlink is a link. We're saying that the value, or what it's going to output as its text, is going to be the employee number, which we had already. And then the link is going to map to an outcome. The outcome is going to be employee. JSF has some rules for how it determines where to go based on the outcome. It will first consult the faces config for explicit navigation rules. Absent those, it's going to look for a page that matches the outcome name. So it's going to look for employee.xhtml. So let's go ahead and create that. And let's go ahead and put something in it. Now you can see on this page what we're doing here is, if we go back to the index, you'll see that I'm passing along as a parameter. So think URL parameter, think query parameter. That's exactly what this is going to get turned into. So this param is, we're going to call it the employee ID. So that's going to be the name of the parameter, and the value should be this employee number. So we're going to forward that along to the page. And so if we go into our employee XHTML, we're going to declare that we want that query parameter. So we do that through metadata on the page. There's a lot of things you can do in metadata. You can do pre-render events. You can do all kinds of things in there. It's a pretty handy thing, and you'll use it a lot. In this case, all we're doing is declaring that this page requires, or not requires, but can consume a view parameter called employee ID. And if it's received, we want to go ahead and bind it to the employee controller employee ID value. Well, we haven't created that value, so let's go ahead and create it. Not that I needed a cheat sheet for that, but you know, we'll, truth be told, we don't really need a cheat sheet for most of this, but it certainly speeds the video along. Alright, so now that we've added that, we can go ahead and republish, since again we've made changes to the Java code. Depending on the tooling you use, you may or may not need to do that. We can resend. Whoops. Pretend you didn't see that. Resending didn't work. Yes, kind of an opportunity to explain something. You'll see this view expired exception sometimes, and what that is, in this case, since I resent the page after redeploying the app, within that form there's a view state object. In fact, if we were to look at this, you'll see right here is this view state, and it's just a hash. And if you submit that, basically JSF, it's a way that JSF enforces protection from cross-site forgery requests. So essentially, if somebody tries to get you to submit something you didn't intend to submit, if you don't have the correct view state, if the view that it believes was constructed in order to render that page, that it doesn't know about that view anymore, and it didn't in this case because I redeployed the application, then you're going to get a view expired exception. In this case, it handled it as a 500 error, and you just saw an ugly page. But in most applications, you're going to present something nice to the user that says, hey, that view is no longer valid. go home? Why don't you go back to the home page, kind of thing. So that was a good learning opportunity in the middle of a video. At least I think it was. So we'll leave it at that. So here's our table, just like we had before. Now you can see we have a link, and you can see I've been playing with this. So we have our little visited rendering. So when I click on one of these, you'll see it says I selected employee 10,005, and it gives me a back button to go back to the main page. But hey, what happened? Where's my filter? Well, if you recall, we talked about the scope and the life cycle for this employee controller, and it was request scoped. So once we left that page, once that page is rendered back, that value is gone again. The only reason that it could keep coming back again and again if you sat here and just kept hitting submit is because we continue to submit the same value again and again. But as soon as we navigate off the page and come back, that value's been long gone. It was gone when the page was finished rendering the last time. So if we want to have it remember that, then we need to change the scoping for our controller. So we could just go ahead and say slap this guy with an @session scoped. So session scope means that it's going to hold on to that data as long as that person, their session is active until they log out or close their browser, whatever the case may be. That's kind of a problem, right? I mean, we don't want to just go and session scope this entire controller because we may have a lot of other things going on in here. Not to mention, you can see sort of this warning. I have to now make this controller serializable because things that live longer can be what's called passivated by the container, and therefore they need to be serializable. Won't get into too much about what that means, but basically anything beyond request scope typically needs to be serializable. So that's lesson one, and why we don't create these controllers that have everything going on in them. So let's do some quick refactoring to demonstrate how you might refactor an application like this in a more intelligent way. So we'll go back to the cheat sheet, and what we're going to do is we're going to actually put the search information in its own form. We're going to create something called the search form, and in the search form we'll put the hired after date in that. And then back in our controller, we now can go ahead and just inject that, and that'll give us an opportunity to demonstrate that sort of thing. Oh, before we do that, why don't we go ahead and also put when we land on our new page, the one that is ultimately going to be our edit page, we're gonna want to have a form for that as well, and have him keep his data in whatever scope he needs to keep it. So you can see by starting to refactor these things out that we can scope them differently. And so some things can live a long time and hopefully are just small bits of information, and other things can be short-lived. So you will see, not only that, just from a general coding point of view, that this results in some cleaner code too. More unit testable code too, I might add. So here we are. We now inject our search form into the controller, and our method to execute our query now just pulls the hired after date from the search form. This controller is request scoped. The search form is session scoped now. So this form will hang around for a while, but the controller doesn't need to. So, but now that we move some things around, we probably need to change a couple of our bindings. So going back to the index page, you can see here the hired after. So we need to bind that to the search form, and our metadata and parameter binding on the employee form needs to change as well. So this error is a case of some bad copy-paste code. I mentioned earlier that persistence context is what you would normally use, or what you would use, but that there's a way to do it through some indirection. I was doing that before when I wrote the copy-paste code, so that's all that is. So let's go ahead and redeploy that. And you can see that redeployed, and everything's been corrected. So now we can go back in. Let's put in our date. And don't worry, we'll hopefully not have to, whoops. So there was, now we click on this and we go back, and you can see now it's remembering our date because that value has been session scoped. So why stop there? Why not go into you know, the repository itself, because or you know, the query itself. So let's introduce a repository. Call it DAO, your repository, whatever you want to call it. And so what I'm getting at is here in the controller, you can see that we're injecting that entity manager, and then we are running the query here. But hey, you know, we might want to run those queries from different locations. We just, as a good practice, we probably want to encapsulate all of our data access into some kind of DAO pattern. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's create something called employee repository. There we go. You see this time I still have persistence context, so I won't get that ugly error again because I did something wrong. You can see also, while I was at it, introduced the new query method. So we have our query after hired for the hired after date, and I went ahead and put the query all back in there, which is where we started. And what that's going to do is let us provide maybe a little more of a user-friendly experience by defaulting the to all employees if nothing's entered. So you can see I basically just do a check that if the hired after is null, then we'll just query from all. Otherwise, we're going to query for exactly what we need. So let's go ahead and redeploy that and refresh. And you can see now it's given us all employees by default and knows that we need otherwise. And by the way, I never did demonstrate the conversion error, so if I do that, you'll see that we get our error message. So we refactored a bunch of code, and I think we'd have to all agree that it's cleaner. But what about our HTML? I mean, you might notice that, you know, there's a lot of common stuff between this file and this file. Maybe not a ton here because these files are so small at this point, but as you can imagine, as your templates get more complex, you're going to want to do some kind of templating. So let's do that. Let's create a new file called template.xhtml. I mean, why stop at the code, right? Why not get the XHTML more reusable? So we're gonna put this in there. We're gonna add a little HR and thing to kind of demonstrate and prove, if you will, that it's coming from the template. So what we're gonna do here, so this page now, so this index page, you can see it was a doc type, an HTML doc. But we wanted to use the template, which is already all those things. And let me go through the template real quick. I guess that was rude of me. But we're using an EL expression to say, put the page title here. Well, now page title, I don't have a bean for that or anything else. But what I'm expecting is that whoever uses this template as what's called a UI parameter is going to go ahead and give me the title to use for this page. And you'll see me do that when I get into the index. And then down here, I'm saying insert whatever the consumer of this template defines to be the content, insert that at this location in the template. So it's like injecting it into this part of the template. So what's nice about facelets is not only can you include things, but you can insert things when you use templates. So you kind of go both ways. I know Struts has templating like that, and a lot of other ones do as well. So we don't need all of this stuff because that's all repeated. And instead, what we're going to do is I'm going to replace that. So this is a UI composition. In facelets, a composition is anything that is some composition of JSF components, and later you'll see that you can actually use those to create custom components and things like that. But in this case, we're creating pages, and in this composition, we are referencing the template. If you have this template here, that's all it takes. We have our normal namespaces, just like we did in the HTML. And we're going to specify a UI parameter. That's going to be a parameter to the template. Here's our page title. And then we're going to define this section that we know we need to define within that template. So this content, everything inside this content defined is going to get inserted here. So that takes care of that. And we have to do the same thing for, I don't have it on here, but we have to do the same thing for our employee if we want to get some reuse out of all this, right? So let's go here. Oops. And typically you put your metadata outside of the defines like that. And this will be employee singular because that'll be the page that we're on. So now, actually I probably didn't need to republish that because it was just a XHTML changes. There's that view ID error again because I hit refresh. So you can see now we have our template header, and everything works as it did before, and I can navigate to pages, and we can see that we're in the same template. So that's the templating. Okay, so let's get into why don't we just fill out the rest of our CRUD methods here. So let's go ahead and take that employee form and let's expand it. So a note on view scoped, technically part of the EE spec, there is no view scoped. You'll see a view scoped in the faces package, but that's not for the CDI spec. EE7 will have view scoped, but in the meantime, we are using a library called faces that will provide. So that's the nice thing about CDI. It's very pluggable, extendable. Just include an faces dependency, and now we have view scope as well. What view scope is that as long as the user's on that page, the user or the information will be retained. As soon as they leave the page, it'll be lost. So here we have our employee ID as we did before, which is going to be passed to us from the navigation, but we're also going to have an employee, the employee that the person is going to either edit, or if they're creating a new employee, it'll be the employee that they're creating. So we have that. We're going to go ahead and add a few CRUD methods to our repository. These methods mostly will just delegate to the entity manager, which would leave some to argue that the entity manager itself is all the DAO you need. I think as you start to write more queries and things, you may find you still want to have some type of DAO pattern, or at least something to encapsulate those different queries. One note here you'll see on the remove, without getting into too much detail, the entity that's going to get passed in here is not going to be what's called attached or managed by the entity manager. So we're going to go ahead and find the employee that's attached and remove it that way. We don't want to do what's called a merge, because if there are changes, it'll actually flush those changes out, and we're not interested in that. So maybe that's worth pointing that out. The difference between persist and merge with respect to JPA, merge takes what's called a detached entity, or an entity that's unknown by the entity manager, and brings it back into, or merges it back into its session, it'll detect any changes, and when the transaction commits, it'll flush those changes out to the database. Persist is an explicit expression of your intent to really insert a new object. If the object already exists, you'll get, of course, primary key violations and things like that. And then find was added to allow us to locate an employee by ID. So let's go down to let's create a new controller that we will call the edit employee controller. We'll use this, keep our controller separate. We have our controller for the dashboard, which is just the employee controller. And now we'll have the edit employee controller, which I'm not claiming that these names are the best, but so now we have our, make sure we get our repository in here. Oh, excuse me. Once again, there we go. So in our controller here, we're going to have a couple methods. So first of all, we're going to inject the form that we need. And as a controller, this bean only needs to be request scoped, but the form is page scoped, if you recall, or view scoped. We're going to inject the repository because we're going to be ultimately persisting these employees, but we're also going to retrieve an employee too if we need to. So we have our save method, which is going to do just that. We're going to use the merge. So whether it's a new employee, so one comment I did make about the merge is, while the persist is an explicit insert, the merge, if it doesn't already know about the entity, it will insert it. So it's a kind of a lazy way of saying insert or update. So we're going to go ahead and merge whatever employee when the save method is called. We're going to have a pre-render event. So when the page is first constructed and shown, we're going to look and see if we have an employee in that form. If we don't, we're going to go ahead and initialize it. And in the initialize, what we're going to say is, if we were given a view parameter for an employee ID, or rather if we weren't, we're going to go ahead and create a new empty one. So we're going to assume you're trying to create a new employee. But if we were given one, we're going to go ahead and locate it using our repository, and we're going to go ahead and set that on the form. So let's go ahead and make that happen with the employee.xhtml. Okay, and let's go ahead and let it rip. Oh, I guess, I should point this out. So in the metadata for that pre-render event, we have to tell it to invoke that. So we have this F event that's in there now, and we're telling it that before you render the view, or pre-render view, there's different event types that are defined. Go ahead and invoke this method, and that's the one where we're going to initialize everything. And then you can see I use that panel grid again, because again, that's great for the form style layouts. And you can see that I basically put in a label, a message, and some type of input for every one of the items that we want to provide input for. So that's what we did there. Oh, and then our command button is, previously we didn't have an action, but now we want to do something. So we're actually telling it that when it's clicked, to not just go ahead and submit the whole form and update the bean values, but go ahead and invoke this method after you've updated those values. So there is something called a JSF lifecycle. It goes through and first it tries to do proper conversions of the values. So if the date entered is not a proper date, it'll fail at that point, and the user will see a conversion error. It will then try to do any types of validations. Assuming it's got good values, it's going to do any sort of validations. Things like, was the field required but they didn't give me a value, or you can really get into some complex validations, even ones that work on multiple fields. So it'll go through the validations. If any of those fail, it will come back to the form and display the error messages. So all the way up to this point, you've yet to really even see your values in your beans yet. Then if all those things succeed, then it updates the model, which is to update the values in the beans, and then it will invoke the application, which is to call any methods or actions that have to be invoked, and then the process kind of rolls back out from there to render the view. So there's a lot more that can be read up on with respect to JSF lifecycle, but that's the basic 10,000 foot. So again, let's go ahead and check this out. So we're back. Of course, it lost that because we redeployed. So I don't really have to keep typing those in again because, again, we have our default behavior now, so we'll just stick with that. And now when we click on this, we can see a form that has everything that we need in it. If I update this and hit save, you'll see it stayed on the same page, right? And I can prove that that actually saved because if I go back, you'll see that it has the update that I put in here. It just didn't go anywhere after clicking save. Of course, if I click cancel, because in cancel we have the outcome set to index, it knows to go back. But the save, well, all we have is an action. Well, that's because we haven't told JSF, we haven't defined a navigation rule for what to do after that method's invoked. There's a couple things it can do. First of all, if this save method returns a string, it will interpret that string as an outcome and navigate according to that outcome. The only downside of that is that now you're maybe polluting some of your controller logic with information about the pages and where they're located, or at least the navigations and things like that. It's not a horrible thing, but it's something we try to avoid. If you can generalize that away and put that someplace else, maybe an XML document, that might be better. So that's where faces config comes in. In here we can define all kinds of things, not the least of which are navigation rules. So let's go ahead and define a navigation rule. So navigation rule typically is from some view ID. You can wildcard these to basically say it doesn't matter what page you're coming from. In our case, we're going to say if you're coming from the employee page, I have some navigation cases that you can try matching. The first one says if you're coming from an action, and then you can use an EL expression that matches the action method that you're invoking. In this case, it's the save. And then you have to have some condition. Anytime you're coming from an action, there has to be a condition. You could just put if true, or you can put some other condition. In our case, we're going to consult the faces context, and we're going to look to see if the validation failed. So if it did not fail, we'll continue with this navigation. If it did fail, then we're not going to define that case, which means it's just going to stay on the same page. And the point of that is that we can see our error messages. So if it did not fail, we're going to go ahead and proceed back to the index page. Then we're going to define another case while we're at it. So, why should the cancel link have direct knowledge of the index page? It shouldn't. So let's go ahead and get that out of here, and let's just call the outcome cancel. And this rule will have the knowledge that means go back to the index page, which means then we can go back to the employee and we can change his outcome to cancel. And then we can redeploy. Okay, so you can see it redeployed. So let's head over here. Okay, and we can jump in and we can put the name, and you can see now it took me back and has my name updated. You can see the cancel now uses the new cancel outcome, and everything works because it consulted navigation rules. Alright, so let's go ahead and round out our CRUD. Let's go ahead and do a new, if you recall, I had the pre-render event handle if there were no ID was passed, no employee ID was passed, and so it would just create a new employee. So all we're going to do is navigate to the employee page with no fparam, and we're going to let that create our new employee. So we come here, we got our new link, we can click on it, and we can just say that, hit save, and now you can see it added me to the database. So let's go ahead and put a remove option in there as well. Oops. And let's see here, we need, so we'll add a column to the end for deleting. we're going to have a remove method on the employee controller. So let's jump in there. So we're going to go ahead and call the remove. And let's go ahead and redeploy. You know, one more thing I forgot. So now that we have, go back here. Now that we have this link in here to delete, command links have to be inside forms. Pretty much a lot of the command things have to be in a form. So we're going to go ahead and not only put this in a form, but let's call it, let's name or ID this form. That's going to come in handy later. So we're going to put that inside a form and go ahead and redeploy again. And okay, so there's our delete link. So we should be able to delete, and bam, it deletes. Rather dangerously, but it does it. Okay, so that's the delete and edit functions. So let's give the user some feedback, because those rows just kind of disappear without a whole lot of info. So JSF has a mechanism for doing that. We'll go back into the controller here, or I'm sorry, into the index page. And right up here above all of this, let's put it even above form here. We can put in messages. So you notice down here we had message singular. That's for a particular field. Messages plural allows you to just dump out all the messages, fields or otherwise. But if we say global only equals true, we only want the global messages, not the field level messages. And then let's go ahead and get in here and add some feedback. We'll just add this. And redeploy. So now we get a nice message that's saying we successfully deleted. Okay, well that's like our dates, that's very 1990s. Let's go ahead and do a little Ajax. Let's just demonstrate some Ajax fun here. So built into JSF is this, and I guess at some point I'll have to get rid of some of my to-dos here. And we will go ahead and pop that in here. So basically what this does, when you put the Fs, remember how the Fs, or not just the Fs, but you can have components that enhance the parent components. It happens to be that many of those are in this namespace, this tag library. But we're basically telling it to turn this component into an Ajax component and fire an event anytime it changes. These event names are what they call client behaviors. And when it's complete, when it's done firing that Ajax event, to go ahead and update the employee's form, and then you can use these little macros. So I'm going to say go ahead and update this form as well. So with that, we don't really need this anymore, and we can go ahead and redeploy. And actually, we can just really redeploy that page, and then we can hop on over here. Learned a lesson on that one, right? All right. So now, if I say 1/1/1990, and as soon as I tabbed off, I promise you that wasn't an enter key, it updated those forms via Ajax, and it's updating this form as well, because as I tab off, it's updating the error message. So you can those events could be on a lot of things, even key up and key down events and those types of things. I don't think that would make much sense with a date, because you would want to make sure you're done entering your date. So that shows you how easy it is to convert that into something Ajaxy. But now let's really do it right. Let's get into PrimeFaces now. So I won't spend a lot of time talking on this one. We're just going to go ahead and dump it in. So I've introduced some new namespaces, primarily the PrimeFaces namespace, which is going to load the PrimeFaces tag library. You'll see I replaced the messages with a growler, which is going to look pretty neat. And I replaced the standard input with a calendar component. I could have left this F Ajax, but the PrimeFaces, they have kind of their own Ajax optimizations, I guess, for their components. And one of the only nuances or differences between the F and the PrimeFaces is instead of render, they use update. That's fine. But you see that pretty much looks the same. And I actually replaced the new link with a button. It's still a link, but PrimeFaces allows you to style it as a button. And then, of course, the big guy is replacing the H data table with a PrimeFaces data table. So that's about the extent of what I did. And and I replaced the simple delete link here with a command button instead, and that's going to have a nice little icon. And because it's Ajax, so PrimeFaces components by default are all Ajax. There's only a handful that do non-Ajax type things. So with the PrimeFaces components, if you don't want it to be Ajax, you have to say so. You have to say Ajax equals false. The reason I have a specific Ajax event up here on the calendar is because I want it to actually happen as soon as a particular event occurs. And I want to tell it what to update. In this case, the command button's already Ajax, so I really just need to tell it what to update. So I'm going to tell it to update the growl component and then the form that this is in so that we can reflect the changes. So that's what we're doing here. So we'll go ahead and republish this page. Okay, and we'll pull it up. Alright, so you see it's a new PrimeFaces data table. And we've got a calendar component here. And we got some delete icons. We got our little growler for when we deleted. So you can see, we've significantly enhanced this application both visually and functionally just by swapping out some components. And I can promise you this data table it's very powerful, inline filtering, all kinds of cool things, including sorting. Now, when I go to sort here, you're going to see the sorting doesn't work. And you scratch your head and wonder why. Well, again, let's get back to some of that scoping. So if we go back and look at what's providing this list of data, we are still providing this list of data out of a controller that is request scoped. So when the data table gets back this list, the PrimeFaces data table is really kind of keeping a reference to the list and applying some sorting functionality to it. But the problem is the list keeps changing with every request, at least from a PrimeFaces point of view. So what we really need to do in order for that to stick, if you will, is we want to page scope this data. And that's nice too, because then we're caching it. We're not, in this case, hitting the database every single time we get some kind of request, even an Ajax request. So let's go ahead and add a new bean that's going to actually hold on to this list of data for the duration that the user's on the page. So let's pull up our cheat sheet again. We'll call this employee data table. And again, there's no real best practices happening here as far as naming and things like that. This is just a demo. So we're going to create a bean. It's going to be view scoped, so it's going to last as long as they're on the page. It's going to basically do everything that the controller was doing as far as retrieving the employees go. Now what it's going to do is it's going to look to see if it's already retrieved them. If it hasn't, it's going to go ahead and refresh them, but if it has, it's going to go ahead and return the cached values. So this gives you kind of an idea of where you can lazily initialize these things and cache them at the same time. But because we may need to force a refresh of that, we're also going to make that refresh method public. And on that note, there are some scenarios we need to do that, namely when we delete. So we're going to go ahead and grab this guy and go back to the controller. And so that method's gone. and our remove method needed to be enhanced just a bit there. Oops. Apparently copying and pasting isn't even something that is foolproof. So so now we have the employee repository, the search form, although now that I look at those things, I don't even think I need those, so we can really kind of yank those out. Oops, I'm sorry, the employee repository we can't. Search form we can. No reason to inject that, right? So the repository, we're going to go ahead and remove the employee. We're going to go ahead and force a refresh on the data table after we removed them. And then we have what we had before, which is a message that's reported back to the user. So let's see how, oh, we've got one more change to make. So now that we've switched to this data table, we're going to go ahead and bind to those values as opposed to we no longer have that producer's method or produces method that's producing the generic name. So we're going to change that binding. And now we're going to go ahead and republish and see what happens. All right. So now our sorting works, along with everything else. And you can see that's still refreshed while maintaining some sorting. All right. And of course, you know, you can see as I navigated away, it lost that information. There are ways, PrimeFaces components have ways for you to bind the sort information and the filtering information so you can retain that stuff for the user throughout the duration of their session. So that is it. That concludes the demo. That takes you from, you know, vanilla project all the way to having something with PrimeFaces where you do all your basic CRUD operations. And so again, I'm going to post the source code, the final source code. Again, it's not meant to be, hey, here's how you should build every app, but it kind of gives you a little feel and flavor for all the different things that go into these types of applications. And I'll go ahead and post the document from which I was copying and pasting. Thanks.